Peak Human.
Les humains à leur meilleur.
C'est tu apogeo.
Peak 人間
Peak Human.
Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we have everyone's favorite Dr. Ben Bikman for another engaging discussion. My name is Brian Sanders and I'm creating the Food Lies film, which we're actively working on daily. I've been doing social media, YouTube videos, and podcasts over the last 3 years as we've produced the film. I'm on a mission to spread health knowledge since I lost both of my parents about 6 years ago. Now I'll act like I'm giving a presentation at a scientific conference and give my disclosures. I take no money from any company, organization, or industry. I support myself with my business partner, Dr. Gary, treating patients with diet and lifestyle and getting them off of medications with the Sapien program. Also with my company, NoseToTail.org, I started after finding out the true health of animal foods that are grass-fed and finished, organic, ethically and sustainably raised. We sell grass-fed and finished meat from our farm in Texas to the 48 contiguous U.S. states. That's at NoseToTail.org. Also with the Peak Human Patreon, where people throw in a few bucks to support the content production and keep me from taking on advertisers. And the Sapien Tribe, where members get extra content, materials, and interaction with myself, health coach Becker, and Dr. Gary. The program and tribe can be found at sapien.org. And also with grass-fed Nose-to-Tail products that we'll be releasing soon. Follow Food Lies on social media or join our newsletter on sapien.org to get notified when these amazing whole food products go live. You can also follow sapien.store on Instagram. We're even doing grass-fed beef tallow all-natural body care products. I'm excited to announce all of these soon. So instead of taking a dime from any product or advertiser or worse, I've developed my own products I'm creating in small batches with the highest quality ingredients. Products that I believe in and across the board benefit people's lives and health. If you choose to buy these, then great. If not, that's completely okay, and I hope you'll find local farmers and artisans to purchase quality goods from. About this episode today, Ben Bikman has a PhD in bioenergetics and a master's in exercise physiology. He is currently an associate professor of physiology and developmental biology at BYU. His lab research, Laboratory of Obesity and Metabolism, focuses on what molecular mechanisms mediate and cause metabolic disorders such as obesity, type 2 diabetes, and dementia. He is especially well-versed in how insulin and ketones work as key drivers of metabolic function. He regularly publishes his research in peer-reviewed journals and presents at international scientific meetings. His new book is called Why We Get Sick, and I'd recommend it to everyone. It gets at the root of almost all modern chronic disease, insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia. We talked today about this at great length. He can speak on so many other things as well, which he did in my first episode with him, Peak Human number 57. I highly recommend people going back and starting with that one. It's one of the most popular episodes of all time. While you're at it, you might as well listen to all the other episodes starting from the beginning. This is how people are changing their life just by walking around listening to free info I've carefully curated. Anyway, please enjoy this episode with Dr. Ben Bikman and join the Sapien Tribe at sapien.org to get the exclusive bonus part of this episode where we discuss the ultimate longevity diet. So happy to get the great Doc Bikman to weigh in on this. We'll just start recording. We're live. I'm not going to think too much about how we're going to start this one. Dr. Ben Bikman, how you doing?
Hey, Brian. Hey, thanks, brother. I'm doing well. Happy to be able to chat with you again.
Absolutely. We had a great podcast a while back. Everyone should go back and listen to that one. We had a great panel session with some other great people at Metabolic Health Summit, and we also got you on film for Food Lies.
I'm glad to be included, frankly. That was good company for a modest little scientist like me.
Well,
I do mean little. When you put me on a couch with Aseem, Dr. Malhotra and Jamie Seaman, oh my goodness, I'm like not only is Aseem's a good several inches taller than me, and I think Jamie can bench press more than I can. I do mean modest little scientist in that case.
Well, yeah, she was on the Titan Games. So if anyone didn't know that, she was on the Rock Show and she's a beast.
Yeah, she's pretty fit.
You're a crowd favorite. Everyone loves Dr. Ben. You're a professor. Why don't you just introduce yourself a little more?
Yeah, glad to do it. Hey, listen, if I am a crowd favorite, and I don't believe that, but it would just be testament to the power of a slightly off-colored sense of humor with a little bit of science mingled into it. But yeah, so I am a scientist. I'm an actual publishing, working scientist and professor trying to play the academic game. I came to science because of an interest in the body. And at the time, it was just sort of a juvenile interest in exercise. And that was reflected in my master's degree, which was exercise physiology. I was honestly intrigued to learn that I didn't know people were even still studying the body, that people were still studying physiology, how the body's organs interact and communicate with the other organs and the body by extension. When I sort of learned that, I'm embarrassed to admit that, when I learned that as an undergraduate, it was just so fascinating to me, the thought that I could be a scientist, that this was something that people still did. And so my first interest was kind of low-hanging fruit, not a lot of thought put into it, which was just, how does the body adapt to a stimulus like exercise? What do the muscles do? And at the time, I was mostly interested in skeletal muscle, the muscles that move our bodies around. What do these muscle cells do to be better, to get stronger and faster? By the end of my master's degree, my interests had totally left muscle behind. I really wasn't as interested in muscle anymore, because there was a study published that found a few years before that fat cells secrete hormones, and these hormones then can promote inflammation and insulin resistance throughout the body. And to me, that had sort of a twofold interest, sort of lit me up in this with two main interests. And one being, I was just intrigued that fat tissue is an endocrine organ, the fact that it was acting like the thyroid gland or the pancreas, these kind of classic endocrine organs. It was just mind-blowing to me that fat tissue would be an endocrine organ. And then second, the fact that these products that the fat cells were making would potentially explain much of the increased disease risk for other diseases that you see in the midst of obesity or, expanding fat mass. And so then that was the shift for my doctoral work. It was studying obesity. And then my postdoctoral work, it was continuing to study metabolic disorders. And while I still dabble in muscle cells, specifically looking at like mitochondrial function and energy use, really more and more I'm interested in fat cell physiology and fat cell function, including energy use and kind of metabolism in fat cells. So that's where I am now. Because I study the fat cell, it means I also focus on insulin, because you really can't understand how fat cells work without appreciating the powerful role that insulin has in that process. And then by extension, the role that insulin has on human metabolism in general, because insulin is a powerful regulator of overall metabolic function.
Absolutely. That's the universal thing that I've discovered in my years of research and making the film. And we've had a lot of great interviews with other doctors and researchers that echo that. And I got a hold of your book, Why We Get Sick. And it's all about insulin resistance, hyperinsulinemia, basically problems with insulin affecting all chronic disease. So I think it'd be good to kind of go through it. You framed it well. I'm trying to write the Food Lies book right now as we write the Food Lies movie, right? It's like, why not write the book? It's hard to just group things and organize. And I think you did a good job of organizing it. It's like, it starts with what is insulin resistance? Why does it matter? Then what the cause is. So it's a problem, the cause is the solution, right? It's a classic progression here.
Intuitive progression.
Exactly.
Brian, I'll say that I appreciate you appreciating the layout of the book, and I have to credit my editor, Claire Schultz, my editor. This is maybe the first time an editor has ever been mentioned on a podcast, but I just have to say this. I had considered self-publishing because it was just so frustrating finding an agent. And once you find an agent, you have to find a publisher. But oh my heavens, I'm so grateful. And I will say very readily and with all humility, my editor really helped lay the book out better than I had originally. So just take that as a note of caution, Brian. If you're going to do it all yourself, good luck. And,
okay.
Frankly, but or just hire an editor is my.
Yeah.
But that was a logical layout. What I really wanted to do, one of my sincere hopes, a genuine altruistic hope, is that this is a book that can change the way we look at health and disease and even clinical practice, where I really kind of make the case that we have been overlooking insulin to our detriment, that our failure to scrutinize insulin and then insulin resistance as a part of that, our failure to acknowledge it and recognize it means that it takes us longer to identify certain diseases, most diseases, frankly, because so many are influenced by insulin resistance. And by failing to acknowledge insulin resistance as a cause of these diseases, of these metabolic problems, diseases that don't seem metabolic, dementia, infertility, then we treat them worse than we could. So if I were pretending in my more egotistical moments, I think this book will change a conversation that a patient and a physician have. So in the patients at the clinic, rather than just measuring glucose and seeing that it's normal, but then looking at, say, hypertension, finding the patient has hypertension, but because the glucose is normal, you don't think about a metabolic problem, and you just give them an antihypertensive medication, and thus you're just treating a symptom of the true problem. My hope would be perhaps this book can help the conversation change, where the clinician sees the normal glucose, but say the elevated blood pressure or any other number of problems like fatty liver disease or infertility and more. And then rather than just giving a prescription for a drug that will just treat that symptom, the clinician and the patient would acknowledge, hey, wait, these problems are all derivative of insulin resistance. And there's a better way to treat insulin resistance than a drug. Even modest lifestyle changes are always more effective than even the best anti-diabetic drug. And I say that with data in mind. Then the patient is treated better. We're, truly addressing the root problem, namely insulin resistance. And it does matter. Insulin resistance, very likely, I almost want to just say it is the single most common health disorder, where in the US, we know that 88% of adults are considered metabolically unhealthy because they fail in some category of the metabolic syndrome, namely waist circumference, high blood pressure, high blood glucose, and then dyslipidemia, namely high triglycerides and low HDL cholesterol. And all of those manifestations of the metabolic syndrome are all related to insulin resistance. That's why it used to be called the insulin resistance syndrome. So this is a problem that is incredibly prevalent throughout the world. And it's also remarkably relevant for these chronic diseases that we're all afraid of. And nowadays, it's even more relevant because it appears that these metabolic problems are the single most common pre-existing conditions with COVID-19 infection lethality. The relevance just continues to get bigger and bigger, frankly.
So glad this book exists because it needs to be more in the forefront of people's minds and clinicians especially. So I'll tell a quick story, sort of a really frustrating situation. We had a woman come in, we do the Sapien diet and lifestyle program. I work with a doctor, we help people. She was 269 pounds, came in, she didn't have the insurance with us, so we sent it to her doctor. The doctor wouldn't get a fasting insulin and wouldn't get a CRP. He just said no. He didn't even offer her, she was like, I would have paid out of pocket or whatever it is. And he just wouldn't get it because this doctor didn't understand.
Yeah, and too often the clinician will justify that by saying, no, your glucose is normal, so we don't need to check your insulin. It just fails to recognize the nuance here, which is in acute settings, insulin and glucose will move together. Here we are, if we both went and ate a couple bagels, glucose would climb, insulin would climb, and they both tend to kind of go up and back down at relatively the same time. But in a chronic situation of mounting insulin resistance, then you have this unchecked insulin. Insulin's getting higher and higher all the time. It has to work harder and harder in order to keep that glucose in check, but it does keep the glucose in check. But that right there, that one single paradigm of hyperinsulinemia in the midst of normoglycemia is not acknowledged. Indeed, many consider it, they wouldn't even believe it would be possible. And so they just look at the glucose, completely overlooking the possibility that insulin might be high, even though the glucose is normal. And indeed, that state right there is insulin resistance. Elevated insulin, but normal glucose.
It's so huge. So many things go undiagnosed. I mean, this woman was obviously having problems. She's 269 pounds and there's multiple other things going on. And yet the doctor wouldn't figure this out. And I think in society, and you'd agree that so many people are walking around without knowing they're pre-diabetic and having these problems because we're not looking at insulin.
That's right. Yeah. So unfortunately, a woman, you would have this patient, this woman she could have left that doctor's office and she would have been given a prescription for her hypertension, a separate prescription for maybe her polycystic ovarian syndrome, her infertility. and maybe even another one to start controlling. Well, I guess if our blood glucose levels were normal, we could stop it there. So these separate medications treating symptoms of a single problem. In these instances of chronic disease, a drug will never cure the problem. It will never reverse it. When a patient leaves the clinic with a prescription, the inevitable result of this, the future will simply be you are now taking that drug for the rest of your life, and the only thing that will change is that your dose will increase. That ought to be a disappointing and even discouraging enough prospect that hopefully the patient can push back enough and the clinician can be humble enough to even present that situation, acknowledge that to the patient, if you leave with this prescription, it will never end. If you leave with a resolve to change lifestyle, and hopefully the physician is sufficiently informed to put them on the way, if only recommending they contact other people to help, then you are truly solving the problem. And when it comes to insulin resistance, it is a problem that is incredibly solvable, not only completely solvable, where you can reverse the insulin resistance entirely, but it's also shockingly fast, where you have insulin resistance resolving within just weeks of the person making lifestyle changes. And I say that these lifestyle changes are simple. They're surprisingly simple. And I kind of outline just these key pillars in the book, and they're also simple, but that doesn't mean they're easy. You know, we should acknowledge that when we start asking people to change their lifestyle, we really, I believe, are asking them to deal with addictions and food addictions. And that is not a simple task. So we who believe we know the answers should always be very sympathetic and compassionate that even though the ideas are simple, that does not mean implementing them is easy.
A lifestyle change is super hard. And if it was easy, everyone would be thin.
Yeah, that's right.
And part of it is I don't think the doctors have the right recommendations. And I think they get frustrated. I talk to a lot of doctors because they give the wrong, old, outdated recommendations. Patients never do them. And then they say, hey, they don't work. So also with this woman, luckily, she's very motivated. She did all the lifestyle recommendation changes. She started eating 2 meals a day, 1 meal a day, nutrient-dense animal foods as the base. I talked to her last night, actually. She said, hey, this is easier than what I did before. She was on all these different plans all throughout her life. And she's like, I'm just eating like simple foods. I'm full. This is great.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I will say that we should also be compassionate to the clinician, because so often one of the reasons the nurse or the doctor may be resisting this, they just don't know. And we only know what we've been taught. It is such a myth, or it is such a mistake to look at any expert, you know, with magical letters after their name, whether it's MD or PhD, and think that that person knows anything more than they've been taught. I truly don't mean for this to sound derogatory. I have such respect for physicians, for MDs, but an MD gets paid to see patients. That is the mechanism of compensation. And it pays well. It is, I think, rewarding in that regard financially. But a physician does not get paid to scour the literature and challenge dogma in order to, just for the sake of curiosity. In contrast, in defense of a PhD, I would say, and I don't mean for this to sound self-aggrandizing, but a scientist gets paid to be curious. I don't get paid to see patients. I get paid to just be curious, to find answers to questions. And that means scouring the literature to find what I call like secondary answers, where it's someone else's answer and I find it and apply it to my own questions. And if I don't find that anyone else has answered a question that I want, then I scrutinize my own ability within my own lab and see whether I can answer the question myself. That's what I get paid to do. And it doesn't compensate me like a physician does, unfortunately, gets compensated. But the reward is partly the lack of financial reward is made up for by the academic, the intellectual satisfaction. And so there really ought to be this very open discourse and communication between scientists and the actual physicians. You know, scientists can be providing the fuel for the engine, so to speak, finding answers. But the physician, the health practitioners are where the rubber meets the road. And if it doesn't get to that point, it's hard to make widespread changes. But I will say there's something wonderful about social media, as terrible as it often is. One of the nice things is allowing even, someone like me to have a voice where where I have the potential to share some of this insight, and then the person can get the benefit by taking that insight and implementing it on their own. But nevertheless, we all only know what we've been taught or learned, and overwhelmingly, clinicians have had essentially no training in nutrition. And I think many would very readily acknowledge that. It's not fair for us to expect they would appreciate, for example, nutrition as much as others do. It was not a part of their training.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that message. And I mean, they don't have the time. They don't have the capacity to do it anyway. You can't coach someone in a lifestyle and diet change in 10 minutes, or even if you have 30 minutes to spend with them. So
that's right. And they might not be able to bill that or get paid for it. So when they are taking the time, it's entirely possible that they're losing money.
Oh, absolutely. Dr. Gary loses money because he spends so long talking to the patients. But anyway, let's get on to it. So this book, it's really about insulin resistance. And it's interesting that you're not mentioning glucose a lot. I think it's pretty refreshing in a way. So yeah, how did you decide that?
I, honest to goodness, think it's because glucose shouldn't be the clinical marker. Like I kind of outlined earlier, if we want to focus on insulin resistance and detecting it and tracking it and treating it, it is not in our best interest to focus on glucose. We have to shrug off the glucose-centric paradigm that predominates all conversations of metabolic health and really embrace the relevance, the impact of an insulin-centric paradigm, putting insulin at the middle. I'm a huge advocate. And again, I mentioned that situation that can happen a moment ago where you have elevated insulin but normal glucose. That is what predominates. And if we're looking at the insulin, we can detect changes so much earlier than the glucose ever starts to shift. Now, I will say, of course, having said all that, I am not saying that blood glucose levels don't matter. Indeed, I believe they do. Namely, if someone is eating foods that are constantly spiking their glucose, which we often do. After all, conventional dietary advice is to eat a high carbohydrate diet and to eat 6 or 7 meals a day or some insanity like that. By constantly forcing the glucose up, we are obligatorily constantly forcing the insulin up because hyperglycemia is lethal. If our glucose levels are staying high, up into the upper hundreds, let alone into the 200s for too long, we start losing water from our blood into our urine, and our blood volume drops and our blood pressure drops and we'll go unconscious. So it is a genuinely lethal state. So thank heavens we have insulin, and one of its actions is to keep glucose in check. By constantly spiking glucose, like most people do all the time, we are constantly spiking insulin. And I understand there's a debate now about this, but insulin matters. Hyperinsulinemia drives insulin resistance, or constantly elevating our insulin is a cause of insulin resistance. And I state this as fact. I could cite easily over a dozen studies that prove this phenomenon in humans, in rodents, and in cells specifically, where right at the level of the cell, we can manipulate this insulin pathway and start to detect insulin resistance just because of the insulin. This shouldn't be debated. Now, I'm not saying that hyperinsulinemia is the only cause, but it is absolutely a cause, and it is one that we can detect very quickly. We can have people come to a lab and just artificially increase their insulin even a little bit. So even if we keep it in a normal physiological range, I'm not talking about blasting the body with insulin. We elevate it slightly, but keep it in normal physiological ranges. These people start to become insulin resistant within just a couple days. So this is a very real phenomenon, and thus I believe insulin should be put at the heart of our understanding the origins of insulin resistance. Again, too much insulin being one of the main drivers of insulin resistance.
Absolutely. I didn't know it was even debated. It seems so abundantly clear. But what kind of conditions and chronic diseases are related to insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia?
Yeah. We could almost just throw up the dartboard. And if you're as bad at darts as I am, then we're going to just hit them all. and they'd all be relevant to insulin resistance. So we can just from top to bottom, multiple neurological disorders can be caused by or made worse by insulin resistance. And I mean things as serious as Alzheimer's disease, which is considered insulin resistance of the brain and compromising the brain's ability to get sufficient glucose to meet its energetic needs. Migraine headaches, epilepsy, both of those problems in at least some instances can manifest due to an insulin resistance in the brain. And as we go down, eyes, ears, for example, as some of the cells involved in auditory signaling in the ears become insulin resistant, they are compromised. And that's why tinnitus is commonly associated with insulin resistance. It's when the insulin resistance has affected the ear. So even tinnitus and ringing in the ears is manifestation of a metabolic problem. Heart function, where the chronic hyperinsulinemia of insulin resistance can promote the growth of heart muscle, resulting in a hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, or the heart failing because it's just too big. It's bigger than it's supposed to be. In the fatty liver disease, we can go down to the gonads, where in women, polycystic ovarian syndrome, the most common form of female infertility, is at its core a disease of insulin resistance, where the chronically elevated insulin is inhibiting the ovary's ability to make estrogens. So it's directly antagonistic to estrogen production, which means then fertility is compromised. In men, there's a study that specifically in the title kind of poses the question, is erectile dysfunction the earliest symptom of insulin resistance in men, due to how insulin resistance affects vasodilation and the expansion of blood vessels. And even muscles, even joints. Arthritis also can be a manifestation, as the arthritis, the cells of our joints, the chondrocytes, have a huge reliance on glucose, and then that can become compromised, potentially in insulin-resistant states. So suffice it to say, in the middle part of the book, when I'm going through these diseases, I'm citing dozens and dozens of studies and just really trying to, frankly, incite this fear. Mm-hmm. I like to joke that the first 2/3 of the book is really kind of a horror story, where I'm introducing this horrific villain that is causing all kinds of problems. And I even kind of go into its origin story of where insulin resistance is coming from. But it has a very happy ending, but I kind of build up the tension, so to speak. It's like a mystery. How are we going to have a happy ending in the midst of all this suffering and pain? Really is a happy ending. But suffice it to say, I do wield that club pretty heavily to kind of beat the reader into appreciating the relevance of insulin resistance, because it just has its hand in so many diseases. And importantly, these are not diseases that are directly a result of elevated glucose. And so all the more reason to stop our obsession with glucose as a marker of cardiometabolic problems and shift the focus on what is absolutely, definitively the more relevant marker, namely insulin.
How does that get confused? So tell us more about the difference between insulin and glucose problems, because even in our world, think it's just all the glucose.
Yeah, right. I will say that insulin should be the focus, and I mean it, and I defend it vigorously, but I also can sort of give a reluctant nod to the idea that it is glucose exclusively that is the relevant variable, simply because I can understand how we got confused. I say that based on two justifications, historic and scientific. Historically, the symptoms associated with diabetes, the main symptoms, were directly a result of the hyperglycemia. I mean, the term diabetes is really derivative of polyuria, so the excess production of urine. So that is one of the main symptoms of diabetics from the very beginning of recorded history, from early Egypt, the first recorded evidence we have of people with diabetes. The note consistently is the polyuria. And indeed, diabetes is reflective. The term diabetes is really reflective of polyuria. Diabetes means to flow through. That is directly related or coming from the polyuria that we see. And the polyuria, the excessive urine production in diabetes, is a result of hyperglycemia. And I alluded to that a few minutes ago. When glucose levels are chronically high, we overwhelm the kidney's ability to absorb the glucose back into the blood. And so while we are filtering the blood, most of what we filter, including glucose, gets pulled back into the blood. So it gets filtered at the kidney and then pulled back into the blood. When our blood glucose levels are too high, we surpass the kidney's ability to pull the glucose back into the blood. And so the glucose stays in the urine. And in so doing, it creates this concentration gradient that starts pulling water along with it. And that's then causing the excessive production of urine, the polyuria. That's directly a result of too much glucose. So historically, we can understand the focus on glucose because that was the cause of the main symptom. They would see the incredible amount of urine, and they could see the flies coming to it and the dogs wanting to lick it up.
I heard the doctors even tasted it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so they could taste a subtle difference in the quality of the urine. Now, generally, I will say glucose is not sweet, but compared to normal urine, I suppose it probably does taste a little different, maybe even a little sweeter. And that's where the mellitus comes from. Diabetes mellitus means a honey-flavored urine, basically, although it would not be honey. That's being pretty generous. But that stands in contrast to diseases of urination where it has nothing to do with glucose levels, like something called, when you have an antidiuretic hormone problem, then you have a polyuria. They still use the term diabetes, but they say that is diabetes insipidus. And insipid means it's tasteless. And so in that instance of the polyuria, it has nothing to do with glucose. Anyway, that's a tangent. So there's a historic justification for focusing on glucose. And then I would say there is even a scientific justification, and that is that glucose is so much easier to measure. We've been able to measure glucose from blood, I think, for centuries now, well, definitely over 100 years. So we've easily been able to measure glucose. And it was only, I think, the 1950s or so or later where we had a reliable measurement for insulin from the blood. And Rosalind Yarrow, I think her name was, she won the Nobel Prize for that discovery of that process, but being able to detect insulin in the blood. But the earliest tests, and even now in a lab, the cheapest tests in an academic setting involve radioactive material, actually, as kind of caveman as that sounds. And there are easier tests nowadays, thankfully. Suffice it to say, measuring insulin is a relatively newer scientific process. And so it makes sense, again, in that even sort of scientifically historic context, that we would have focused on glucose more initially just because we could actually measure it when we couldn't measure insulin. However, having said all of that and all the compassion and understanding that comes with that, I would say it is getting less and less justifiable now that we have the scientific expertise and knowledge that we do, namely indicating the relevance of insulin, as well as enabling the measurement of insulin now so easily. I say that it's less forgivable every year, frankly. Insulin should be replacing glucose as the metric that matters because we can measure it now so easily.
So then what causes the insulin problems is the next question, because a lot of it is the glucose, right? If you're eating foods and refined foods that spike it all the time, but there's tons of other things that cause the insulin problems.
Yes, that's right. So I already mentioned hyperinsulinemia earlier, and I think it's appropriate that I start with that because I do believe that hyperinsulinemia is the main driver, and it is driven, of course, by these constant excursions of glucose being spiked. It does come back to diet. And with regards to, I could elaborate on the hyperinsulinemia. One of the mechanisms whereby hyperinsulinemia is likely causing the body to become insulin resistant is due to its direct effects on fat cells. And this touches on this idea of energy toxicity or lipotoxicity, which I think is sometimes invoked erroneously. I think sometimes when people mention those terms, I fear some people don't really know what they're talking about. It might sound terrible of me to say, but if I were to invoke that term, I would explain it at the level of the fat cell. And insulin tells fat cells to get big. There is no avoiding that. In fact, it's impossible for a fat cell to grow without insulin being elevated over fasting conditions. To my knowledge, that cannot happen. And when we make fat cells in the lab, we have to load the fat cells with insulin. We have to put the insulin in that little culture in the medium, the bath basically that the cells are growing in. If we don't increase the insulin, we cannot make the fat cells grow. It's impossible.
It's part of its job. If you just tell quickly give the overview of like what it does.
Yeah. So insulin will stimulate both the uptake and the storage of nutrients. So namely, it will stimulate the uptake of glucose and fatty acids into the fat cell, and then it will activate the processes telling the cell what to do with that energy. And that is such an overlooked aspect of insulin as a hormone. Not only does it facilitate the uptake of nutrients into certain cells, but it tells every cell what to do with the energy that it's taken in or that it has at all. That insulin is a metabolic signal at every cell in the body, telling the cell and the body by extension what to do with energy. That is such an important and overlooked aspect of insulin. So in this case, insulin is coming to the fat cell, telling the cells to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So we have these fat cells that are starting to reach their maximum dimensions, this really fat cell. And almost, if you will, as a form of self-preservation, the fat cell starts to become insulin resistant. Essentially, the fat cell is thinking, if we can assign this sort of intelligent perspective from the fat cell is thinking, if I continue to respond to insulin, I will get so big that my cell membrane itself will damage. It's basically like the cell will pop, it will burst if it continues to get bigger. And so it becomes insulin resistant. Now, there's some mechanisms there. Suffice it to say, the cell will become insulin resistant, the fat cell now. So now, in contrast to constantly storing energy and never letting it go, because insulin very powerfully inhibits the breakdown of stored fat, what is called lipolysis, now the fat cell is refusing to listen to insulin. It is becoming resistant to what insulin's trying to tell it to do. So now, in contrast to storing fat, it starts leaking fat. At the same time it's leaking these free fatty acids, this overfilled fat cell is also leaking pro-inflammatory proteins. In it's doing it, we have to sort of be forgiving to the fat cell, because while that does cause problems, and I'll elaborate on that more in a moment, one of the actions that it's trying to do is increase blood flow through the fat tissue, because as it's getting so big, it's getting further and further away from blood, from capillaries that it needs in order to get oxygen and give up its CO2 and exchange nutrients. And so part of what it's hoping to accomplish with these pro-inflammatory cytokines is increasing blood flow. But it's a lost cause, because as the hyperinsulinemia persists and the insulin resistance persists, what ends up happening is these overfull fat cells are leaking free fatty acids and pro-inflammatory cytokines. And those two are an essential part of the equation, the formula for spilling the insulin resistance to the rest of the body. So you have all the tissues downstream of our fat, and that's like the liver and the muscle and the brain, the gonads. They start to become insulin resistant, potentially due to what the fat cells are releasing. So this long conversation now, as I'm elaborating in far too much detail, I think, but we're talking about causes of insulin resistance. Hyperinsulinemia is a primary cause, and it's likely due largely to what it does to our fat cells. And then as the fat cells fall first. That's the first domino, and then it starts bumping into the rest. And so the other tissues of the body start to fall, so to speak, and that's when glucose levels can start to climb. Now, anyway, all of that is my very long-winded way of emphasizing that hyperinsulinemia matters, and the fat cells become too full or they have too much energy in them, that energy toxicity, then they start spreading that throughout the rest of the body. Now, I will add, just to be thorough, there are absolutely other causes of insulin resistance, and just for the sake of brevity, I'll mention them. The stress-related hormones like cortisol and epinephrine, that is what's mediating the insulin resistance of stress. And that can be an emotional stress like relationship problems or depression. It can be physical stress like injury or sleep deprivation. Whatever the cause, if cortisol especially is spiked, that being the main stress hormone, the body will start to become insulin resistant. And then lastly, I just need to mention inflammation. In states of elevated inflammation, whether it's an infection or whether it is an autoimmune disease, where the body is fighting itself and using inflammatory pathways to do that, the body will also become insulin resistant. So, and there are a few other smaller variables that we could get into, but those are the main three. And I believe they all contribute to what we see in kind of clinical chronic insulin resistance. But even still, I believe hyperinsulinemia is the most relevant of all of them.
Well, you know what that is? You're just describing our poor modern lifestyle. Like everything
Yes,
is
that's right.
the food we eat, the stress, the not sleeping enough, and inactivity, lack of exercise. Well, I mean, we'll get into those later because that's kind of the solution, right? So we'll get to that at the end. And I'm interested in you kind of were touching on the personal fat threshold where you tell us the difference between hyperplasia and hypertrophy.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah. So the personal fat threshold is this theory that once a body has reached its optimal fat level, as we are forcing the body to store more fat than that starts to affect metabolic health. And now we have metabolic disruption like insulin resistance. I do believe that theory has value. And to me, the theory has value if we look at it from the level of the fat cell, where if a fat cell has reached its limit, then the body starts to suffer. And I think that's important that we distinguish it from fat cells or fat tissue growing through proliferation or hyperplasia, as you mentioned it. So the fat cell that I was mentioning earlier, that is when the fat tissue is growing through hypertrophy of the fat cells. So we aren't getting a higher number of fat cells, but the fat cells we do have are getting bigger themselves. Each individual fat cell is getting fatter. That is in contrast to hyperplasia of the fat cells, where the fat cells, none of them ever get too big. They will grow a little bit, and then we will start to recruit more fat cells to the area. We'll make new fat cells. So the fat cells are hyperplastic, but never getting too big on their own. That is associated with exquisite insulin sensitivity. You can have a person, so you could have two people, and this is, I guess, part of the problem. If we look at the personal fat threshold from a whole body level, you could have two people that are both getting fatter. Their percent body fat is going up at the same rate. They're 15% body fat, they're 20% and 25%. And you could have the person they could be the same level of fat by way of percent. But if they're getting fat due to hypertrophic fat growth, they have metabolic consequences immediately obvious. If they're getting fat due to hyperplastic fat cells, they stay very healthy paradoxically. Now, I'm not saying that there won't be other problems. What I should say is their insulin sensitivity will maintain because the fat cells can continue to respond to insulin, pulling in the fat and pulling in the glucose because they never get too full. Once they start to get a little full, they just recruit a new fat cell. So the body can continue to get fat. And the power of manipulating the fat cells or the power of the fat cells in determining insulin resistance throughout the whole body is exquisitely obvious with one particular class of anti-diabetic drugs. It is known, this is very well documented, you can take an overweight type 2 diabetic, someone who's so insulin resistant that their glucose levels have started to climb, and you give them a type of drug in a class called thiazolidinediones. I don't remember the trade names of any of these, but it's a class of drugs sometimes known as TZDs. And the way these TZDs work is by forcing hypertrophic fat cells to become hyperplastic fat cells. So basically, this drug starts recruiting new fat cells, and so then all the fat cells can be more of a modest size because we're just making more of them. And so it kind of gives the fat a break and allows the fat cells to start responding to insulin again. And now we're storing more fat in our fat cells. That works very well. You can really treat someone's diabetes and insulin resistance well by giving them these drugs. But oddly enough, one of the consequences of making the fat cells more insulin sensitive again is that they start to get bigger. Their fat tissue gets bigger, so the person gains a substantial amount of weight. And indeed, that is the main reason adherence to those drugs is so poor. Even though the person's more insulin sensitive, they look at themselves and see the 30 pounds of pure fat they've gained in the last 6 months and determine that there's something wrong and that it's not worth it.
Yeah. I love this argument of which came first, the insulin resistance or the obesity.
Oh, yeah. Oh, geez. So I actually give that ample time, ample discussion, even in the book. And I'm afraid I show evidence on both sides of the story. What I will say is that you can't make fat cells getting big unless insulin is elevated. And so I would think in some instances, you could have the hyperinsulinemia both driving fat growth and driving insulin resistance at the same time. So it could be that the insulin resistance and the obesity are happening concurrently, neither necessarily driving the other. But then once you have the fat cells reaching those hypertrophic dimensions, it starts to feed the hyperinsulinemia even more by now driving insulin resistance itself. But suffice it to say, I do believe the two can happen in parallel. You don't have to have one causing the other. But once you have big fat cells, that is definitely driving the insulin resistance, or I would say at that point, accelerating it dramatically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's like a push-pull thing. It's kind of both.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's really just sort of an academic curiosity to wonder how, clinically speaking, I would say it becomes less relevant because we just simply say, regardless of how this started, let's just lower your insulin. And that's why, as a scientist, I'm such an advocate of scrutinizing diet, because if you focus on how to lower insulin best, you just simply start cutting the macronutrient that spikes it the most, namely carbohydrates. And isn't it just wonderful that this macronutrient that I believe is the main culprit in driving insulin resistance due to the frequent hyperglycemic moments and hyperinsulinemic spikes, it is also the one macronutrient that humans don't need. And so it's wonderful that we can just sort of point our finger at it and say, you just eat less of this. And no one can say back, yeah, but I can't eat too little because I need it. No, you don't. And I'm not saying don't eat any. I'm not saying everyone should go zero carb. I'm not saying that. But that is the response. We can just say, if someone says, oh, yeah, but I need my carbohydrates. No, you don't. You might be addicted to them. You absolutely have no biological need for them.
And a lot of them tend to be not nutrient dense. I mean, there's many reasons not to eat them. The reason to eat them is they're delicious, and I agree.
That's right.
But
it adds some wonderful variety to the cuisine, but that's it.
It's a sad reality, especially in our modern world. Everything's made up of carbs and processed carbs and stuff. But I mean, I think it's great. Like, my big health transformation happened when I basically just switched out carbs, just breads or whatever, for mushrooms and onions. Right. And it's delicious. It's still delicious. It still adds variety. And I just remember that, however many years ago. And that's the real only thing I did.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. I also love the more kind of pungent vegetables like radishes, onions. Those are things I used to hate when I was little. And if little Ben with a full head of bright orange hair looked at old bald Ben eating onions, I know little Ben would say, what the hell are you doing? I remember vividly my dad paying me $1 to just eat some onions. I'm sure he was just exasperated, thinking, you darn little kid, just have some variety. But now I love them. And I would also add, sort of explore the idea that carbohydrates really add a wonderful variety to the diet. The more often we're eating them as fermented, then the better. Because when we ferment a carbohydrate, two awesome things happen. One, we actually get bacteria, those probiotics, that I do think are relevant to human health, although I do think we also understand very little. The enthusiasm, I think, has outpaced the actual science in that area. But nevertheless, we get a probiotic, and what the bacteria are eating is the starches and the sugars. The bacteria don't eat protein. They don't eat fat. I mean, protein's not a fuel at all. It should never be considered a fuel. But it's not eating fat, and it's eating the starches and the sugars. So when we fermented something, that's why you can eat a pickle. Brian, next time you get pickles, look at the nutrition label. And even though that is a cucumber, the carbohydrates listed as 0, because essentially it's just this sort of fibery husk that's left over. All the digestible starches have been digested theoretically by the bacteria. That's part of the power. And so fermented foods like sauerkraut, which I love, pickles, which I love, you can thank the bacteria for having really chewed through much of the starches already. And that's relevant to human health. It's relevant to COVID-19 because infections, bacterial or viral, thrive on glucose. It is certainly in the case of bacteria, and even with viral infections, that is the primary fuel. And for bacteria, it's the exclusive fuel to fuel the explosive growth of the infection. That's why every type 2 diabetic knows they can get infected. Any little scrape, it's so much more likely to get infected just because you are basically throwing fertilizer at these infectious pathogens by letting them just feast on all the glucose that's available.
Well, you're preaching to the choir. I'm obsessed with fermented foods. That's the only vegetables I eat are fermented vegetables. Well, I don't know. Is an onion a root? Well, I don't know what it is. But
yeah, well, it is. Yeah. So we typically say avoid the vegetables that grow in the ground. But when it comes to like radishes and onions, I don't care. I'm going to eat those things.
Yeah, exactly. And fermented stuff, there's even other benefits. They have more vitamin C. You get some vitamin C there. Kimchi has a good amount of vitamin C. And also they decrease the anti-nutrients. I mean, this is our traditional methods, right? So you're getting rid of the bad things.
And I would say one more benefit is you're getting some short chain fats, which I am a huge advocate of. I'm a huge advocate of a variety in the types of fats we're getting, long, medium, and short. And essentially for humans to eat short chain fats, it only comes from fermented foods. That's why they taste so tart and sour. It is the short chain fat. It's those short chain fatty acids that are so, sour, frankly. And so that's what they produce. I mean, bacteria are magical, and that's why ruminants are, by extension, so magical, like a cow, because of what the bacteria do for them. And in this case of us eating fermented foods, the bacteria are not only chewing through the starches and the sugars for us so that we don't have to, and we don't have to get a glucose and insulin spike, but what they leave behind, their metabolite from that is short-chain fats. And short-chain fats are very healthy for humans to eat. And that's what provides that flavor that keeps me coming back all the time, that really tart flavor.
Absolutely. And I'll just tell you my diet. It's nose-to-tail animal foods. It's eggs, fish, all kinds of sardines, fish eggs, fermented vegetables, mushrooms, onions, and avocado. It's basically all I eat, and I do different combinations of it. What do you think?
Oh, I think that's dynamite. If you were my student and I was grading you on nutrition, I'd give you an A and pat you on the head and say, good boy, Brian. No, that's why you're healthy. That's why you've got you're a lean, healthy guy. That is a dynamite diet right there.
I love it. Well, I got the good doctor on my team.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I just want to throw out some other things that I found in your book that were super interesting. Like why women live longer than men. I've always wondered this, and you have an idea about that.
Yeah, right. Well, one reason, at least metabolically speaking, is that women have better fat tissue than men. And specifically, women have more subcutaneous fat than men do. If a woman and a man were both starting at, really low equal body fat level, and they both started gaining fat, like a little boy and a little girl, they're both really scrawny little boys and girls. As they both start to grow through puberty, the girl starts to get fatter and the boy doesn't necessarily. I mean, he certainly doesn't need to as a result of puberty, but a girl just through going through puberty will start to store more fat. And that is just because fat is essential to fertility. A woman has to bear the metabolic burden of reproduction. It is a tremendous responsibility. It is a tremendous, I would say, burden and sacrifice that the woman makes to have a child. And I say that with a lot of emphasis just because of my wife. I'm so mindful of her sacrifice with her body to bring our 3 beautiful little babies into the world. A woman has to bear the metabolic burden, and much of that is ensuring that she has enough energy to not only feed the fetus as the little baby is growing. Baby is literally taking mom's energy to grow. And then second, once baby is born and mom is breastfeeding, that is, once again, literally energy that mom is giving to her baby. It's a beautiful thing when you think of it, just the nature of offspring and the role the mother plays in that. Of course, dads help where they can, so not to sell ourselves too short, but the woman bears the metabolic burden. So that's my point. So when you have a little boy and a little girl going through puberty, the little girl will naturally start to gain more fat than the boy will, just because it is so much more essential to her physiology. And I would say because of that, because it is so essential, I think it's interesting to note that it also has so much less of an impact on her health. That little girl is storing more of her fat as subcutaneous fat, and that is hormone driven. The female sex hormones will activate the storage of fat in subcutaneous fat depots like the butt, the hips, breasts, even backs of the arms, as much as some women may hate that. Those are all inert places. They're benign. That is a good way to store fat. In contrast, a man will typically store much more fat in visceral space, so deep within the abdominal cavity surrounding the organs. And you can imagine that fat mass, you don't want it to get too big, because if it gets too big, it will start to physically compress organs. And so the body starts to try to remove that by having immune cells come in and help clear that out. And then the way the immune cells are calling for other immune cells to come help is by releasing those pro-inflammatory cytokines that I mentioned earlier. And so that fat is typically more inflamed. in the body's, it's almost like it's trying to fight this, like a fatty infection, I mean, it's not an infection. So I don't want to be misunderstood. But yeah, women can get fatter than men because of how they store their fat. Subcutaneous fat is really a benign fat storage, and females need it. And indeed, those fat cells produce leptin much more than fat cells from men. And leptin is essential to fertility. It's sort of one of the unspoken realities of human fertility. You have to have leptin from fat cells to stimulate the brain to make the hormones that would then go to the gonads to make both sexes fertile. And of course, women are much more sensitive to that. They need more of that signal than men do, which is why if a girl gets too lean, she doesn't have enough leptin and she can no longer ovulate. And it's also, in fact, to flip that around, it's also why puberty is happening so much earlier in little girls, particularly because female fat tissue makes more leptin. If you have a little girl that's getting too much fat tissue, then there's too much leptin, then that can stimulate the brain to turn on that fertility process potentially a couple years before it would have normally. And so childhood obesity is absolutely one of the main drivers of this phenomenon of precocious puberty or early puberty development.
It's so much earlier than even just the 1800s. It was the age difference is insane.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And we see this even in ethnic disparity, where you're seeing this like in Black and Hispanic girls. I think it can happen at like the age of 7. That's a shockingly early age for a little girl to be developing.
Mm-hmm. So then you're saying, so women have less visceral fat, more subcutaneous fat. And this is super interesting. I love learning about visceral fat and just exploring it more. Dr. Sean O'Mara, he's really does a lot of MRIs, had him on the podcast, and, really physically looking at the visceral fat and quantifying it and showing different diet and exercise methods to reduce it, and just highlighting how negative it is, right? How you're saying, yes, it's worse. It's a bad thing to have.
Yeah.
Basically, you're saying since men have more visceral fat, that might be why they die sooner.
Yeah, that might be why they're certainly more susceptible to, one of the reasons why they're more susceptible to cardiometabolic problems, just because that fat is associated more with insulin resistance. Now, I will say, you mentioning Dr. O'Mara, it's interesting for me to note some of the external variables that go into dictating whether the body is making more visceral fat or subcutaneous fat. And there was a study done in humans a number of years ago where they gave these people for a period of time 2 different solutions to drink. They were isocaloric, so the same amount of calories. In one set of solutions, one like kind of battery of tests involved a glucose solution, and the other one was a fructose solution. And while both got fat, both gained fat drinking these kind of drinks, these glucose or fructose shakes, where they got fat was totally different. The glucose drinkers put relatively more of their fat as subcutaneous fat, and the fructose drinkers it was like 2 or 3 times more of their fat grew in their visceral adipose tissue, their visceral fat, as opposed to their subcutaneous. So we can manipulate that. We can inadvertently force that visceral fat by over-consuming fructose. And of course, that is something we do exquisitely, easily these days. I would urge every parent listening to this, don't let your kids drink fruit juice. That is pure fructose. It's just fructose in water. You think you're doing your kid a favor by having them drink fruit juice rather than soda. And sure, compared to soda, it is better, but that's a far cry from just letting them drink milk and water. I believe fruit juice is just horrific.
Terrible. Absolutely. And it's so funny that people that say all calories are the same, it's just such a joke. I mean, there's a million studies on all sides. Like, this is just one of them. You can look at so many angles of why that's untrue. So yeah, the hormones matter, the processing, in the liver of the fructose matter, like it's all kinds of things.
So, in fact, if we want to go on about just the calorie thing, part of our obsession with trying to fit human obesity in the lens of thermodynamics and the laws of thermodynamics, I believe, has been a tremendous fiasco. It has not helped. Our obsession on calorie number has not helped because it has led us to fear an essential macronutrient in the form of fat and focus on a non-essential and insulin spiking macronutrient in the form of carbohydrates. But when we ignore what macronutrients do to hormones like insulin, we have lost part of the complication when it comes to attempting to reconcile everything just a calorie number. And by that, I mean, even insulin can dictate metabolic rate. So the actual expenditure of calories by the body kind of running at higher RPMs, so to speak, is heavily influenced by insulin. And there are multiple studies where the effect of diets, keto, like low carb or high carb, where it's low insulin or high insulin, there are studies to show that difference in metabolic rate can be as little as 100 and as much as almost 300 calories per day of a swing by being in a low insulin state or a high insulin state. And these are isocaloric diets, so it's not like they're eating more food, because even eating, of course, can stimulate metabolic rate just as you have to digest it. And they had the same amount of protein, because we know protein can have a metabolic effect because it's harder to digest. Well, not harder. It just takes a little more effort to digest protein. And so we know that insulin will directly influence metabolic rate. In my lab, I have a study in review right now, so it's pre-published. And people have likely, if anyone has ever seen anything I've said on social media, they've probably heard me mention this. It's just taken so bloody long to get it published because we had to wrap up experiments, and it's always a hassle getting something published. But we find that insulin and ketones have directly contrary or contrasting effects at the level of the fat cell and controlling the metabolic rate in the fat cell. Specifically, insulin will slow down metabolic rate at fat cells. Ketones speed it up by about 2 or 3 times, even in humans. We took fat biopsies from humans, so we confirmed this phenomenon in humans. So these hormones, that's my long-winded way of just emphasizing, hormones matter even in the context of calorie, even in the context of the thermodynamic perspective of obesity, which I believe is flawed, partly because we just don't account for energy the way we should. So I think we should first scrutinize the quality of the nutrients, the quality of the calories, including what these calories will do to insulin. And then only second, scrutinize the number of calories. That shouldn't be the first conversation that we have with someone who wants to lose weight. It shouldn't start with lower calories. I believe strongly that it should start with calorie quality. Control those calories that are spiking insulin the most. Then, once that person has gotten to that new level of body fat, if they want to continue to lose body fat, then we can progress into the realm of scrutinizing calorie number, including fasting, etc. But I do not believe that should be the first conversation.
Absolutely. There's so many reasons for that too. Yeah, just calorie is not a calorie. We'll just put it that way. And the hormones, it's a nutrient density, it's all kinds of things. And also just equation, the energy balance equation, people don't understand, yes, calories matter, but there's the other side of the equation is your expenditure, which is what you started getting into.
Yeah.
Just people don't realize that what you eat changes the other side of the equation is how you know what I mean?
Oh, totally. Yes, you're exactly right. One, it can change. In fact, even in a variable I didn't mention now, but I mentioned previously, but will now because you're provoking me to. But yeah, so hormones can dictate energy expenditure in the form of just metabolic rate, but they can also affect something that I call energy wasting, because if your insulin is low, you not only have a higher metabolic rate, like we just described, and that is a very real phenomenon. There can be no ignoring that. And insulin being low also starts to result in the production of these things called ketones. And as everyone knows, a ketone is simply a piece of a fat molecule. A fat is a long chain of carbons, and we've just simply started pulling off these small little chunks of carbons. Now, what's so important, and then some of those ketones will get just excreted from the body. We are breathing them out or urinating them out. They just directly leave the body. People don't respect that, where every ketone has an actual caloric value. In fact, roughly similar to what glucose has, frankly. What people aren't appreciating is that every ketone is basically like a piece of a metabolized fat molecule that we either had to burn through metabolic rate or store. By wasting it, we've introduced this entirely new outlet with energy that is not at all dependent on our metabolic rate. We are just wasting energy. We're giving it back to the universe, if you will, by breathing and urinating it out. So I think that is another part of the metabolic advantage of a low carbohydrate state or a low insulin state. One, the higher metabolic rate, and two, the introduction of a new outlet for energy, namely this energetic wasting.
That's so great. So yeah, I think some people who don't like our point of view call us energy balance deniers, and we're not denying that there is some kind of energy balance. They're just not thinking about these other things that you're mentioning.
That's right. Yeah, and I resent that. And I don't like to drop my credentials very often, but my PhD is bioenergetics, literally the study of energy in organisms. And so if someone calls me a calorie denier, I resent that. And then usually intellectually, I put them in their place, if I may be so bold.
I would love, I mean, I wouldn't want to go against you.
Yeah. Well, mind you, I can't really hold my own in almost any other regard. That's really the only way that's the only avenue I can, only place I can.
Well, it's a great one. We need you there. So,
well, it's relevant these days. Yeah.
So, okay. So what else on this path? There's even little studies where they showed visceral fat or subcutaneous fat is different. I just know there's all these experiments that we've done to show different aspects of, or even the 800 calorie experiment when people only got 800 calories. There's also the body set point. Sorry, I'm throwing a lot of stuff at you, but your body has a set point. If you restrict calories too much, it wants to go back.
It defends. Yeah. The body
So these are all the factors here that we're kind of go into. There's where you place the fat matters, subcutaneous or visceral, body set point, all this stuff. So go for it. Yeah,
sure. So that body set point idea is compelling because it sort of hints at the body wanting to defend where it is. It's almost like the body's reluctant to change. Well, sometimes even for the better and in some instances for the worse, like gaining weight. And so you can start overfeeding people and metabolic rate will really start to climb as a way to attempt to kind of offset this, because the body is constantly seeking homeostasis. And so if it has gotten accustomed to a state, it will try to keep that state. It will resist changes. And like I said, and you've mentioned, including manipulating the metabolic rate in order to defend that. One really compelling aspect or nuance to that is what was seen a few years ago in a study that looked at the metabolic rate in people who had gone through The Biggest Loser TV show. Mm-hmm. Now, everyone knows that on The Biggest Loser, you take morbidly obese people and you essentially starve and exercise them, not to death, but to substantial weight loss, substantial weight loss. And the great tragedy of that kind of starvation or low-calorie induced weight loss is that hunger always wins. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I do this with my students in my class when we start describing obesity, when we start exploring obesity, I kind of present this analogy to them. And I tell them, imagine I'm inviting you all over to my house for an amazing buffet. And I have the world's best chefs coming to prepare the best foods you can possibly imagine. You're all invited. I want you to come as hungry as possible so you can eat as much as possible to really enjoy it. And then I ask my students, what would you do to come to my home as hungry as possible? And invariably, these clever little minds invariably come up with a consensus of two things. They would exercise more and they would eat less. That is exactly what we try to do with conventional advice for weight loss, including on that show, The Biggest Loser. We are giving them this recipe that is going to drive their hunger to the point that it will demand to be heard. You can only ignore it for so long, especially in our environment of such readily accessible foods. Hunger will win. So in these studies, what happens when someone loses weight? Through any means, metabolic rate will go down. If there's less body, there is less metabolic demand and energy will go down. Now, typically, as someone starts to gain weight back, metabolic rate will climb back up, commensurate with body weight. So we could say that body weight and metabolic rate are coupled. When one is moving up, as body weight is changing, metabolic rate will too. So in these people that lose a phenomenal amount of weight, their metabolic rate ends up being much, much lower. But what happens is they start to gain the weight back, the metabolic rate doesn't have a commensurate increase as well. It's like we've uncoupled, we've broken that system apart by inducing such a horrific state of such, kind of metabolic insult. I'm not sure how else to describe it, of just starving them in the midst of this extreme exercise to lose weight. They suffer metabolic consequences from that. And indeed, you don't see any reunion tours of The Biggest Loser because they gain it all back. And I just ache for these people who go through that method of weight loss, where it's starvation induced, when the reality is you don't have to take such extreme measures. You don't have to starve yourself. The alternative paradigm here is that which is embraced with the low carbohydrate diet. It is simply control carbs to bring your insulin down and then eat whatever else you want. Focus on protein and fat, which have minimal insulin effect, and that'll be the way to do it. And that'll be the secret for weight loss that does not involve hunger all the time.
Exactly. It's so funny. I love that story, and it's my favorite thing to talk about. Gary Taubes told me a similar story years ago.
Yes, in fact, I stole that from Gary.
Oh, you did? Okay, yeah, it's amazing.
I had Gary come and give a talk here at BYU at my university, and he used that analogy of, imagining the world's best chef.
Yeah.
And I just ate it up.
So
Brian, you caught me. All credit to Gary. Gary, I'm sorry for stealing your analogy, but I just loved it too much. I can't help myself.
I love it so much. And it's just so funny that these people the powers that be gave you a recipe for hunger as a solution. You can't white knuckle it. This is all I say. I'm actually writing a second book. It's basically about satiety. It's basically about this type of thing. So I think the best diet, kind of to recap what you're saying, the best diet is how to eat in a bit of a deficit. Yes, you need to create some caloric deficit, but how do you do that without raising your insulin, without messing with your hormones, and without being hungry? And what that is,
without deliberately pushing the plate away when you're still hungry. Yep.
Exactly. And what that is, sort of a low carb diet. Like you said, it's you're eating the satiating foods with the protein, the micronutrients, the fat that you need, and you don't need the carbs and that you don't want to. So, okay, here's another one. If you just lower what you're eating, you're just eating less of bad foods. And you're also just eating less protein, which is a bad thing, because if you're just knocking the calorie count down, you're knocking everything down. And it's just never going to work, right? You can't expect someone to be restricted forever.
That's right. And I do think that this low-fat, low-calorie obsession can lead to genuine nutritional deficiencies. I heard Rob Wolf at a talk earlier in fact, at the Metabolic Health Summit where you and I met up earlier this year. He said something in his talk, which I thought was just brilliant. And he said, we should be physically active enough that we can eat more to ensure we don't have nutritional deficiencies. And that's sort of the opposite of what you're hinting at, which is when people are deliberately eating less, especially when it's not nutritious foods, their risk of nutritional deficiencies just becomes so much greater. Brian, I wanted to elaborate one thing you'd mentioned when you'd mentioned protein and fat. What is so interesting about that mix, which I believe, I like to joke, it's a divine mix. God made all proteins. The best proteins come with fat. And
Bacon,
by that, I mean,
steak.
yes,
Bacon.
yes. Well, animal, the best proteins for humans are absolutely beyond any doubt animal proteins. And that is beyond any doubt. It should not be debated. Plant proteins are inferior in every way, not only because of the amino acid profile, but because of the anti-nutrients you mentioned earlier that deliberately inhibit the digestion of the proteins, like phytic acids and tannins and trypsin inhibitors. Those are very real molecules in these plant proteins, not to mention the heavy metals that they contain in these supplements of plant proteins like lead and arsenic. But we are not meant to get our protein from plants. It is laughable. It is laughable. We should ridicule this and pity the fool who believes it's true. It is laughable to think that plant proteins are the optimal protein source for humans. And part of this also is that plant proteins, as fake as they are, don't come with fat. And it might seem stupid for me to say that, or strange, but the best protein sources, like, beef, because, historically we never ate chickens because chicken meat just doesn't have fat in it. And I do think we never used to eat chickens. We only had chickens for their eggs. But nevertheless, eggs and meat and dairy, all those proteins come with fat. And there is even scientific validation for that idea just when you look at the level of the muscle, where if you exercise train people, you will get a significant increase in something called muscle protein synthesis. Actually, look at the muscle cell and see how much more protein it's making. Exercise alone will have an effect. If you give this group of subjects protein, you get a significant bump up over normal. Then if you give them protein and fat, in a 1-to-1 mix, in a 1-to-1 ratio, like what you see in an egg. That is by mass, a 1-to-1 by mass of protein and fat. You get even beyond protein alone, another significant bump in muscle protein synthesis. So what people need to appreciate is that protein and fat are more anabolic than protein alone. Yes, indeed, I'm saying fat is anabolic at muscle. There's even evidence to show that omega-3 fatty acids are anabolic at muscle. So we shouldn't ignore the relevance. And so when people are focusing on getting protein, even if it's through like a whey shake or something, I believe there's power in protein and fat together. And Brian, you'll forgive me for just making a brief plug. I believe that's been overlooked enough that with a couple of my brothers, we made a protein shake that is protein and fat in that magical 1-to-1 ratio. And anyone who wants to just learn more, I won't say any more about it than that. Go to Get Health, and health is spelled HLTH, gethealth.com. And in fact, if you want to try some shake, enter the word PEAK, PEAK, and get 10% off. So you can take advantage of Brian's podcast.
I need to try some myself. Yeah, I just checked out your site, and yeah, it looks great.
I would just emphasize again, protein and fat are supposed to come together. Let them come together, if for no other reason than to enhance the anabolic effect at muscles and to satisfy. Protein alone will not curb your appetite like fat will.
Yeah, you need that satiating quality. Fat and protein's perfect. And yeah, I mean, yeah, I love whole foods, but if you're going to be on the road, if you're busy, why not get this meal replacement that you guys made? And it's just, hey, if you need it, and if you don't, then eat your meat. So
I agree 100%. Let there always be the focus on real food. But in our world, in our culture, there will always be room for just the convenience of something like a shake.
Absolutely. And I just remember what I was going to say is back to plant protein. We're talking about a fallback diet. I really want to make this point. I mean, I am making a film about this, about animal protein. This is what we need. Yes, we can eat plants for a while. That's because humans evolved and we have this amazing ability to run in this other metabolic state that I call either the fallback metabolic state or the failed environment metabolic state, where your environment failed you. We couldn't get an animal. There's climate, something prevented you from getting an animal, the primary protein source and fat source, and we developed the ability to not die from eating plant proteins. But it's really confusing when modern living people with adequate money choose to do a fallback diet.
Yes, I agree. And in fact, I will say, when we first started putting the shake together, when a couple of my brothers, when I mentioned this ratio of 1-to-1 that I wanted to get, they brought up, well, should we use pea protein? It is so much cheaper. And it is. It is a fraction of the cost of, for example, whey and egg whites and collagen. But it is so inferior that even though we could have saved a lot of money and we could have, like any manufacturer could, it makes sense from the manufacturer's perspective, because they can save money and they can virtue signal that they are vegan friendly and avoid animal products. And so they get that benefit, that status of being able to check the box of vegan friendly. And to me, it was not worth it. Plant proteins are inferior in every way. It was not worth compromising the quality of the shake just to virtue signal or save a few bucks.
I love that. And just in general, though, just like the diet, I don't want to get into the diet wars in general, but it's just the problem is that it can technically produce weight loss if you're eating a plant-based diet. Again, it's taking advantage of this metabolic state that we evolved to survive, but it's not thriving, right? And it's not ideal. We're not going to get the same amino acid profile. You're not going to get the same nutrients. There's so many things in meat. I did a whole tweet storm about it. I was just trying to get across this point that the sad reality is that it can work temporarily, right? And you have to eat food. It does technically work for people short term. So how do you disprove it? It's so hard to...
It's such a subtle descent into unhealthy, but it happens. I will say a vegan diet is incompatible with human life. The person will develop multiple forms of lethal anemias, like iron deficiency anemia and pernicious anemia because of the lack of B12, which you cannot get. And cells, you must have B12 to use folate, which you must have in order for cells to divide. And when you look at the rapidly dividing blood cells, that's where the deficiency becomes most obvious. And then we go on with the essential omega-3 fatty acids. no amount of alpha-linolenic acid, as helpful as that can be, and I do mean that, alpha-linolenic acid, the kind of seed version of omega-3, if you're getting that from a milled seed, I actually think it can be healthy. It is the most oxidized and thus most ketogenic of all the long-chain fats, but you cannot rely on ALA from like flax and chia in order to provide EPA and DHA, which a human must have. We just don't convert enough of it to be functional. You can't get that from plants either, and it's laughable to think that our ancestors, even algae oil, which is what vegan will take, you're not going to get it in the right amounts. So a vegan lifestyle, I said it a moment ago, I'll say it again, that is incompatible with human life, and it should be discouraged at every moment. And I mean this, if one of my kids became vegan, I would be heartbroken.
Absolutely. I mean, you'd have to intervene. The problem is,
yes,
they don't always like to listen to their parents. You know, that's how kids work. So,
oh no, I get it. Yeah, but it's also reflective of the fact that veganism is often deliberately self-harming, almost. It is almost this masochistic view of I am sacrificing my health. And the myth is that in so doing, by eating these foods, you're benefiting the planet. And
or
that
the
is just not.
Yeah.
That's right. And I would encourage anyone who believes that to read a compelling book, a provocative book called The Vegetarian Myth. It is so powerfully written by a former vegan as she details her efforts to try to live this life of not harming anything, and then realizing that it is impossible. Indeed, this world is such that something must die for something to live. There is no avoiding it whatsoever. There is, I hate to say this cliche, but there is the circle of life. Something must die, and its energy, its molecules are given back to the earth in order to another organism to foster the survival and growth of that organism. It's impossible to circumvent.
I love that you mentioned that. Lierre Keith is a friend. I had her as maybe my 8th guest. People should definitely go back to that 8th podcast of mine, read her book. And also my last podcast with Rob Tunks, an Australian farmer, details in length how many animals die to grow plant foods and crops, and he has experience growing sheep and plants, and he's like, there's no question how many more, I mean, there's studies to prove it too, how many more animals die growing these crops. And
that's right, these large scale farms. Yeah,
absolutely. So we kind of did cover these lifestyle changes that can help reverse insulin resistance or make sure you don't become insulin resistant or have other insulin problems and glucose problems. So maybe you could just recap some of that as sort of a takeaway for people.
Yeah. So to me, a smart diet to improve or prevent insulin resistance is built on 4 pillars. And I would emphasize them in order of importance. Control carbohydrates. So just be smart about the starches and the sugars that you're eating, and make sure that you're focusing on the ones that have the least effect on glucose and insulin, like, for example, fermented vegetables that we talked about earlier. Second, prioritize protein. Make sure you're getting enough animal source protein every day to facilitate good health. And I don't mean just maintenance of lean mass. I mean all the things that we use those amino acids for, including the production of countless hormones throughout the body. Third, don't fear fat. Let fat be a primary part of the diet. Indeed, the bulk of your calories, the majority of your calories, I believe, should come from fat. And let fat come with protein, and then add it. Sure, enjoy it, but do that sparingly. When you're adding oils and butters, I think that can go a little too far. Just be prudent with that, and don't seek a certain amount of fat. People will often say, well, how much fat should I be getting? There's no answer to that. It is just whatever you need to be satisfied, and indeed whatever comes with the protein. And then fourth, it is watch the clock. I do think there is tremendous power in intermittent fasting. Giving the body a break from eating. I think there is tremendous discipline and clarity that can come from that, not to mention the metabolic benefit of keeping insulin low when it would have been spiked in a meal. But one note of caution with intermittent fasting, I just see too many people use intermittent fasting as a kind of glamorous binge and purge, where they will fast all day and do one meal a day, and then they just make themselves sick eating so much food so quickly that they go to bed, they feel such remorse, they don't sleep well, and they wake up with this conviction, I'm not eating all day. And then the same thing happens. So a person who's using intermittent fasting, they need to be disciplined about it, make sure they're not abusing it. If they can do that, then it is tremendously powerful.
That's a great point. Yeah. I wanted to ask you one more question, but we do these Sapien Tribe bonus episodes. So if you stick around, I can do my last question that's all related to this stuff we've been talking about.
Bet.
Longevity diet. I think there's a perfect balance with the fasting, with the food, and how to live long. And it's a delicate balance. So I'll ask you that when we get off. But thanks so much. Just throw out, so you have Get Health, HLTH, and then what are your other websites or handles?
Yeah, so really just on the main ones, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. If someone just looks at Ben Bikman, PhD, and Bikman, no C in Bikman, Bikman, Ben Bikman, PhD, they'll find me. And I use social media really just to share science. I really try not to make it about me. It's never about my family, of course, but it's not like a personal connection. It's just me sharing what I believe is relevant to human metabolism.
I love it. Yeah, it's very valuable. You do little videos and all kinds of interesting stuff. So definitely give them a follow. Thanks so much, Ben.
Oh, Brian, my pleasure. Thanks again for the invitation and the opportunity to talk about all these very relevant topics. Thanks again.
Absolutely. And yeah, just Why We Get Sick is the name of the book. I want to plug that because we talked about very little compared to, how much great info is in the book. So definitely get the book.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, this was a spoiler. Go buy the book.
Okay. All right, there it is, everyone. Make sure to join the Sapien Tribe at sapien.org if you want to get the bonus part of this episode that I alluded to. It was really cool to pitch him my longevity diet and hear his thoughts. We have a limited number of lifetime memberships available at a discounted rate, so please check them out at sapien.org, where you can also find the Sapien program if you're ready to lose a meaningful amount of weight and change your life. You can find out about all the other things we're doing there, the film, the nose to tail meat, and everything else. Join the newsletter, get the free Sapien food guide. It's all at sapien.org. See you next week.